Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Actuary Voices podcast. I'm Preeti Vashisht, editor-in-chief of Contingencies magazine, and I'll be hosting this episode. Today, I'm joined by Rade Musulin, author of the article, Managing Risk in a World of Polycrisis, the cover story of the July-August 2026 issue of Contingencies. Rade is a longtime leader and volunteer within the Academy. He's also the recipient of the 2025 Jarvis Farley Service Award. Rade, welcome. It's so great to have you with us.
Great to be here. Looking forward to our conversation.
Great. I remember, Rade, we met last year, late summer, and you had this idea to write this article. And it's been in the works for a while. So I just want to go back a little bit to our conversation and tell us what made you think about writing this article.
Yeah, well, one point I'd make, Preeti, is I didn't write this just because of the Iran war. In fact, you'll remember our conversation was long before that. And it's really been something that grew out of a pattern I've observed many times in my career. I began actuarial work in 1979 during the aftermath of an oil shock in the 70s that produced huge inflation and high interest rates. And then in 2004, I saw hurricane models underestimate rebuilding costs because geopolitical demand for lumber, because of the Iraq War, increased catastrophe demand surge in events like Katrina. And more recently, we've seen geopolitical disruption again through energy from the Russia-Ukraine war, and that's had effect on supply chains and insurance costs. So I wanted to try to explain in the article why actuaries who think about these things as kind of external or too hard to deal with, and hence not in their analysis, can really miss something really important. And may I say one more thing? I've seen a tendency in actuaries in, recent years to focus on coding and calculation and advanced data analytics. And that's important, but it's necessary but not sufficient to really understand risk. And this article tries to explain why that's the case.
You've mentioned this a little bit in your response, Rade, but tell us what you mean by we're living in a polycrisis. What does that mean? And why should actuaries be concerned with polycrisis?
Well, that's a term, Preeti, that was coined by some academics and adopted by the World Economic Forum years ago. And it's really not just about several bad things happening at once. It's really about how risks interact and amplify one another. So, for example, you may have a conflict that affects energy prices due to the Strait of Hormuz, but energy prices affect inflation. Inflation affects interest rates and asset values, and then those things affect insurance affordability, political stability, and government responses. So for actuaries, the concern is that these correlations between risks kind of appear separate, but they're really part of an interacting system of risk that you have to understand in order to get your head around the environment you're dealing with. This is known as systems thinking, and that considers kind of how complex and interconnected systems respond to events. And it's a really critical tool in climate risk, which is where I spend most of my time as an actuary. And we covered that in an International Actuarial Association paper, which I was lead author on, that basically talked about the need to think about things like climate risk from a systems thinking perspective.
So you mentioned earlier, Rade, that you've been an actuary for a long time and you've been seeing these sort of patterns, you've been following them. So how would you say that the risks that we see today are different from those of the past? What's changed? And, some actuaries will think, hey, we've always dealt with uncertainty. So what's different now?
Well, yes, we have always dealt with uncertainty. In fact, probably uncertainty is our forte, you could say.
Yeah.
But what's really changed is the speed at which events occur, the interdependencies, and the potential for non-stationarity in the entire system. The complexity of the supply chains that we operate with now is mind-boggling. One piece of, this pen I'm holding, has probably gone through 4 different countries in manufacture, and you have no idea where they are. And those supply chains create significant vulnerabilities, as we learned the hard way many, many times over and are about to learn with the Iran war. And we've also got, cyber systems and the internet that can transmit disruptions almost instantaneously. And the institutional guardrails that helped keep the system working have been badly compromised in recent years. And it's not all just due to the actions of the current administration. It's due to a series of events that has weakened things like the United Nations and the World Trade Organization and a lot lot of things that helped keep these risks under control in the past. And so it's really not that our models are less sophisticated now or that, that they're not adequate. It's just that those models may not fully represent a world whose underlying relationships are changing and yielding the data that we trained our models on inapplicable to the future.
And how have you focused on one part of the risk that you discuss in your article, and that's the geopolitical side of things? So, was there a particular moment or something that made you think, hey, the actuarial profession sort of needs to rethink how we approach geopolitical risk?
Yeah, I'm tempted to answer this question with 9/11 because I was actually standing in the Florida Capitol right next to Governor Bush's office, who was the brother of the president when 9/11 happened. And that had all kinds of ramifications for the insurance industry and policy. But I think maybe a better example is the hurricane season I referred to earlier, and maybe I can elaborate a little bit on that. I was working as an actuary in the Southeast United States at that time, actually based in Florida, and we had 7 large storms hit in about a 14-month period, including Katrina. And the industry's experienced some massive demand surge. And it happened to be a time when lumber markets were constrained because of the effort to rebuild Iraq after the Iraq War. And a lot of our lumber supply had been shipped overseas. And while our CAT models understood the wind very well and the hazard from the hurricanes, the models didn't catch the economic environment in which the rebuilding would occur. And that experience really taught me that extreme events do not occur in economic isolation nor in temporal isolation from one another. And, the current geopolitical environment has brought that lesson back very forcefully because we're now in a period where if we have a series of large catastrophes, I fear we're going to see a repeat of this historical example because there's enormous inflationary pressure built up in things that you need to rebuild buildings after disasters. And that has not shown up in the CPI and a lot of the metrics we see, but it's going to, just like it did in Katrina. And so I think this is something that really hit home to me, and it sort of helped spur me to write this article.
So, Rade, I'm going to ask you, what was some of the lessons that you learned after Hurricane Katrina, and how have you been able to adopt them in your work since then? Would you be able to talk about that?
Sure. And by the way, it wasn't just Katrina. It was Charlie, Francis, Jean. I can't remember them all. Rita, Wilma. There was a whole lot of them. So I think what those things taught me is that, events are not independent, that you can't just look at a catastrophe as a one-off thing. And you have to think about things that happen that risks your organization faces in the context of the economic environment in which you operate. And that's something that I think we've been losing touch with a bit as big data and all the, fantastic modeling tools we use as actuaries have made us really think we can calculate our way out of any problem by, I say torturing the data until it confesses. And I think sometimes, that can really lead you to bad answers. And it's not that the models or data analysis is bad or wrong, it's just that it's incomplete. And so I think that, trying to understand where your information's incomplete is kind of one of the most important things an actuary's got to think about in day-to-day work.
And I love that you brought about, Ray, the idea, the concept of interconnectedness of all these crises, because that's one of the big areas of the academy, really, to talk about interconnectedness within the practice areas and how issues from, say, life would impact casualty, would impact, other practice areas. So thank you for bringing that very important concept to life in your article. I'll go back a little bit. You say that sophisticated models and big data can create blind spots. You just mentioned that. So, for me, it's like, how can more information become a weakness? That's a question that I think of.
One of the things I referred to in my article is a fantastic article by a guy named David Brooks, which if you Google it, it's under catastrophic complexity. And it describes the failures that led to the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the, Gulf of America. We're in the U.S. now, but in the Gulf of Mexico in my days. And basically what Brooks described was a situation of what he called sort of the collision of complex systems with the human mind. And you get to a situation sometimes where the system is so complex that you lose sight of where the risks are in it, right? So the weakness that really arises from more information is when you get false confidence that you understand things that are only correct under the conditions in which you trained your models. And so it's a case where sometimes the analytics can create a very precise but wrong answer. And your job as an actuary actuary is to understand situations when that may happen. And then the solution, when it does, is not to abandon the models, but it's to be more explicit about where they're reliable, where their assumptions are breaking down, and where scenario analysis and expert judgment may be needed to supplement the models. I'm in no way saying throw the models away. I'm saying instead, just they're tools. They're not the solution, they're a tool. And you need to understand their limitations. And the only way you can do that is to understand the context in which they operate.
Excellent point. And again, you've touched on this, Rade, a little bit. But, when you think of a geopolitical risk, there might be actuaries who might be thinking, well, how's a conflict halfway around the world? How is that going to affect an insurance balance sheet? Can you just expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah, we could spend an hour listing all the ways. In fact, that's a lot of what I'm doing in my consulting work here in Australia, is helping insurers to figure this problem out. And if you think about it, the answer is quite obvious. I mean, there's the first clear way is through claims. This is going to ripple through supply chains. You're going to have higher material costs, repair delays, shortages, etc. But it's also going to affect assets and capital. I mean, just look at the gyrations that have occurred in the financial markets since the Iran war started. You've got movements in interest rates, currencies, credit spreads, equity market effects. Third, you've got operations. This is one a lot of people, I think, don't pay as much attention to, but we've got risk of cyber attacks. It's certainly possible that our opponents in this war could use unconventional means to respond to bombings. They could go with cyber. You could see things like infrastructure failures, etc. The electric grid goes down, or you have shortages. And certain countries, for example, in the Asia, are heavily dependent on LNG for their electric supplies. So you may see the lack of liquefied natural gas in a place like South Korea interrupts manufacturing that then cascades over to the ability of a company in the United States to operate. And I guess the last thing is kind of legal and contractual things. You got sanctions, tariffs, export restrictions, and all kinds of uncertainty over policy wording, what's covered, what's not. So I think the important point is that the insured loss may not look like war damage. It's not like someone dropped a bomb on the building you're insuring, but it may appear months later like as a more expensive roof, an unavailable vehicle part, or an investment loss happening at the time claims are rising.
Great. This was excellent. Thank you so much, Rade. So you also draw parallels in your article between climate risk and geopolitical risk. So are there some lessons from climate modeling and scenario analysis that actuaries can apply to the environment today?
Yes, this is an area I've spent a lot of the later part of my career working in as I've moved into climate risk. And you really, when you get into climate, I'd say even before I answer the specific question, the first thing you have to understand is that years ago when we were doing life insurance tables or auto pricing, the actuary was the expert in the room. Everything you needed to know was in the insurance database. You just have to have a good model, project your claims costs, and that's all you needed to do. Well, in the world of climate, we've got to interact with scientists, economists, policy planners to understand things like how the climate's going to change is going to affect hurricanes, or how decarbonization policies are going to affect the uptake of electric vehicles or renewable power. Those things are not in our databases that we can really just query and figure out. So what you have to do in climate is, first you've got to use scenarios to explore plausible futures. And so you cannot simply use the past 5 years to forecast the next 20. You've got to think about various outcomes depending on government policy. I mean, just look at what happened between the Biden and Trump administration on electric vehicles, for example. You have a political change, and then all of a sudden the environment of the vehicles you're repairing totally changes. So that's a scenario analysis exercise you could have run in 2022 and said, hey, what happens in the next election if somebody who's hostile to electric vehicles comes in, right? That's a scenario that you needed to plan for. Second, you need to use the systems thinking to examine feedback loops and how things interact with one another, right? As an example, in Australia, where I live, since the Iran war, the uptake of electric vehicles has rocketed, because people here are doubling down on renewables and doubling down on decarbonization. And that's a systems thinking example where, an event that triggered an energy shock is now having a massive impact on the type of vehicles you're insuring. And third, you've got to refresh scenarios and integrate them into decisions concerning capital, reinsurance, etc. I mean, that's what we learn in climate risk, that you've got to adapt all of your scenarios and think about how they're going to affect your capital, your reinsurance program, programs, your operational resilience. So all this, climate risk is taught actuaries to combine quantitative and qualitative reasoning when the data is incomplete. And that capability transfers directly to geopolitical risk.
Let us take a moment to remind listeners that you're listening to Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. On this podcast, we talk to Academy volunteers and leaders, as well as friends of the Academy, about what inspires them about their work, both professionally or as a friend or volunteer with the Academy. Please subscribe to Actuary Voices on your preferred podcast platform. And now, back to Preeti's conversation with Rade Musulin.
You've talked a little bit about this, I think, in your response. But, you also talk about the concept of signposts, rather than trying to predict the future, you say use signposts, and that they are a more useful way to think about uncertainty. What would you like to say on that, Ray?
This is, again, a lesson we learn in climate risk. Again, it hasn't been fully adopted in the United States, but around the world, there's something called the ISSB, which is part of the IFRS Foundation that's promulgated reporting standards for climate. And you've got to put together scenarios of the future that may be 2030, 2040, 2050. And so what you can't do when you put those scenarios together is develop a scenario in 20 for what's going to happen in 2035. And forget about it till 2034. Because let's say we were going to say that electric vehicles were going to be 70% of vehicle sales by 2035 or something like that. Well, we would then create some signposts that would say, well, if that's going to happen, by 2029, there needs to be a tax law change to put in an EV credit. By 2031, we need to have so many charging stations deployed around the country. By 2034, we need to build up a domestic auto industry that can generate EVs or whatever those things might be. So you've got to really understand what those signposts are. And then as you move through time, if you have not hit those signposts or they don't happen, then your scenario is not going to materialize. And you need to redo your scenarios and constantly iterate them over time as events unfold. And that concept is quite well established in the academic literature around scenario analysis. And it's not just for climate. It could be supply disruptions having to do with the war we're in right now. It could be something having to do with cyber activity. It could be most anything. And the important thing is that the signposts need to be connected to actions. So if you fail to hit a signpost or things are not unfolding as you predicted or you speculated when you built your scenario, you need to change your assumptions. You may need to change your reinsurance purchase. You need to change your product mix as an insurer from EVs to internal combustion vehicles or whatever. At the end of the day, what they do is replace the impossible objective of perfect prediction with a disciplined process of monitoring and updating as you go through time.
So, you talk about engaging with the board in your article. So if you just had 5 minutes with an insurance company's board of directors, what's the first question you'd want them to ask you, Rade, as an actuary?
If I were a board member, I'd say, well, what are our largest dependencies and concentrations of risk that are not visible in our normal risk register thinking? And that's where something like a supply chain vulnerability would show up. If you realize that, you source 30% of the parts you use to replace vehicles from one supplier or something. That's not something that would often show up. And then you have to ask, well, what if that supplier was in Taiwan and there was an incident with China and Taiwan? How would that affect my ability to fulfill my policy contracts to repair the vehicles or something like that? So, this stuff could include geographic concentrations, critical suppliers, dependence on cloud computing services, and all sorts of things like that. And it's fundamentally trying to understand what dependencies the insurance company has, in the case of an insurer, that could prevent that company from fulfilling its customer promises. And until the board really understands those risk points and dependencies, it can't properly understand the organization's geopolitical exposure or its resilience. But really importantly, Preeti, one other thing, it's the board's role to ensure that the organization has proper governance and strategy and a process to identify risk. It's not the board's job to micromanage kind of how management deals with that risk. So what you're trying to get the board to do is to understand, do you understand the threat landscape you're facing? And do you understand how your organization is vulnerable to those risks and threats? And how are you as a board going to be able to ensure your organization is resilient and can survive the unexpected.
Now, Rade, I would want to talk a little bit about public policy and obviously coming from the academy. So, where do you see the profession adding the most value as all these risks become even more interconnected? How do you see that playing out?
You're asking me to summarize my 35 years or 40 years of actuarial volunteer work at the academy into 2 minutes.
Maybe, yes.
Oh boy. I'll pick one of several because there's a lot of answers to that question. But I think one particular area that we add a lot of value in, and it's largely what's gotten me into the work I do today, and about half the volunteer work I've done with the Academy has been in this space, which is really trying to help policymakers understand what the boundary is between the private insurance market and the public risk-bearing entities that we have, be those something like the Florida Hurricane Fund or the California Earthquake Authority, or in the federal case, the TRIA program for terrorism, or a number of other situations. It's often the case around the world, not just in the United States, that the private insurance industry can't handle all of the risk, either because it's too hard to measure, it's too great for the capital that we can hold efficiently, or maybe it's just risk that's just not measurable and diversifiable, that we just can't understand it well enough. And one of the things actuaries can do is help explain where that boundary lies for policy planners and help them understand how to design public-private mechanisms to ensure that markets operate, consumers are served, and the economy is as healthy as it can be, right? And a lot of what the Academy works on in public policy is really boils down to that problem and helping solve that. And I think one thing I learned when I was working in various state legislatures or in Congress or here in Parliament in Canberra is that, we bring relatively, as much as any human can, nonpartisan and objective views of reality. And that's something which is really rare and precious in the political system. And I know one of the things that helped me when I was working in Congress, in fact, they invited me back to testify in front of the Senate Budget Committee in 2024 from Australia on this, is because they trust actuaries. Even, I remember being in the hearing and it was chaired by Senator Whitehouse, Senator Grassley was there, Mitt Romney, Senator Kaine from Virginia, from both sides of the aisle, and they listened to us, all of them, because they didn't see us up there as partisan advocates, but instead advocates for the truth and the facts. And so I think, we analyze financial consequences of various public policy decisions, and we do so objectively. And I think we really can help shine a light on where the policy choices lie. And it's not our job to make those policy choices, but it's our job to help make the decisions that others make as effective as possible.
Wonderful, Rade. And I will say the Academy thanks you for all your work that you've done for us. So thank you so much. And you did capture a lot of your work, I think. So when you think of the insurance industry, Rade, is there any risk you think that the insurance industry is underestimating today?
Yes.
Okay.
Again, well, I have to pick one. There's a number that I think we're probably underestimating, but I guess maybe thinking about the article as opposed to AI or other things, I think it's probably the possibility of like combined balance sheet shocks, bit of a tongue twister there, from, multiple events. This gets back to the Polycrisis thing. You could have a geopolitical event that would increase claims inflation at the same time investment markets decline and have a big currency movement. For example, if the Australian Reserve Bank here responds to inflation by raising interest rates and creating more unemployment or something, while the U.S. Federal Reserve lowers interest rates to spur the economy, you could see a significant shift in the value of the U.S. and Australian dollars just due to monetary policy decisions that are made. And it could obviously go the other way. I wasn't inferring anybody do anything particular. But, each of those things you can kind of manage by themselves. But the problem is trying to understand how those things interact and if they all occur at the same time. And you may have several buffers in your risk management framework fail at the same time. And so the interaction of risk is the essence of Polycrisis, which was the essence of the article I wrote. And it's really difficult to see those risks sometimes when you manage an organization in silos. When you get the claims department over here, you get the underwriting department over there, the actuaries in their ivory tower here, and the investment people over there. And so I think you've got to join the organization up, look at this as a system, and think about risk holistically. And I think that will help you deal with things like polycrises and, combined balance sheet shocks. And, this could be cyber disruption. It could be AI. It could be a pandemic. It could be a change of government where you have an election and the control of Congress and the presidency changes, or one of a host of things that could happen. And again, these things can ripple through the system in ways that are not just one thing, but they're a large system of things you need to prepare yourself for. And it's not, by the way, doom and gloom. It's not like we can't do this. We've been doing it for centuries. It's just, I think sometimes when we start depending too much on our data and models and forget about the big picture, we kind of lose sight of this, and then bad things happen.
If an actuary is listening to this podcast who wanted to do one thing differently when they got back to work tomorrow, what would you recommend? Where do they even start?
I'd do a thought experiment, and I would pick some off-the-wall geopolitical scenario. And it could be, something like a coup d'etat in a major country which produces critical minerals. Or it could be, a change in trading patterns where, one country cuts off the supply of critical minerals or something. And try to then identify, okay, how could that affect my organization? Like, list everything that could do to me. Would it affect my, claims inflation? Would it affect my pricing? Would it affect my investments? And, would it cause you to change your pricing? Would you change your reinsurance? If it's going to impact your inflation, how am I going to deal with the sums insured on my properties? And how am I going to understand my liquidity if all of a sudden, for example, you have like what we had in 2004 and 5, a big catastrophe occur in a period when you had this supply shortage? What are you going to do about that? And if you do that thought experiment, it could be anything really. You kind of turn some geopolitical risk into some practical effects on your organization and the value chain of your organization. And then just try to understand, like, is that stuff in my models? Is that stuff in my risk register? Do I understand it, etc. I think you can go home and do that. Do it on the train or when you're driving home. Being safe driving, of course. But, just do that thought experiment and see. And then ask yourself, have I really got all that risk in my current models and systems? And if you do, I'll give you an A+ and buy you a beer.
And then you conclude, that the profession needs to combine analytics with judgment, structured judgment. So if listeners remember just one takeaway from your article, what do you hope it is?
Well, despite what I've said, I am an actuary and I do believe in data and numbers. So please don't misunderstand my messaging here. That, modern analytics are indispensable, but they're not necessarily sufficient to understand complicated systems. So you need to use your models and data where they're informative, and use scenario analysis and systems thinking where the data is incomplete. And, that's not a retreat from actuarial science. It's just a fuller application of what we do as actuaries. And, our advantage is really to be able to combine quantitative and qualitative tools to get a really clear and well thought out view of risk. And that's what I'm really urging that you do. Use all the tools in your toolkit, not just the one that says GLM model.
Thank you for these excellent takeaways. We're very glad that you could join us. So one thing that we do on Actuary Voices podcast is have each guest leave a question for the next guest. So here's a question that was left for you. What impact has AI had on you? Has it changed how you solve problems in your professional or personal life? And have you noticed any cognitive surrender?
Excellent question, whoever cooked that up. AI has been really useful to me as a research assistant, and I'd almost call it an intellectual sparring partner. It's helped get me into mental shape to do things like have this podcast and, speak coherently. And, it challenges me. It helps me identify gaps in my thinking and when my arguments are unclear. But, I use AI to propose, but I continue to decide. And I continue to write my own articles, and I continue to think my own thoughts. And importantly, I verify facts and test reasoning and make sure everything comes out in my voice, not Claude's voice. And, at the end of the day, I would describe AI as being cognitive augmentation, not cognitive surrender. And I try very hard not to surrender to AI every day.
I guess we just have to be mindful of that. Yeah. And before we wrap up, Rade, what question would you like to leave for our next guest?
I think the area I'd like to go into is that if you accept that actuaries in the future are going to have to operate in more multidisciplinary teams, what professions do we need to prioritize to learn from in order to do a better job as actuaries? Is it psychologists so we can understand human behavior? Economists? Is it scientists? Who do we need to partner with to be better actuaries?
I think that's an article in the making, Rade. That's a great article idea. Well, that's an excellent question. Thank you for sharing that. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today and for these takeaways and for writing that article for us. And to our listeners, be sure to read Rade's article, Managing Risk in a World of Polycrisis, the cover story of the July-August 2026 issue of Contingencies. You'll also find a lot more thought-provoking articles in that issue. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Actuary Voices.
You've been listening to Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. Please visit our website actuary.org for a wealth of information about the work that the Academy does. You can follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn as well. And of course, please subscribe to this podcast on your preferred podcast platform.